In July 1959, less than 2 years after Sputnik, the United States Air Force completed a secret study of one of the most powerful machines ever seriously proposed. Project Orion was a spacecraft propelled by nuclear explosions. It was orders of magnitude more powerful than the rockets currently being built. Most thought Orion could open the solar system to all of humanity. But this report did not ask whether Orion could reach Mars or Saturn with dozens of scientists. It asked a far more provocative question. What would the United States military actually do with a fleet of nuclear-powered spacecraft? The answer came from a young Air Force officer almost completely forgotten today, Captain Donald Mixson. And his proposal was not for a single spacecraft. It was for an integrated military force extending from low Earth orbit to the moon and beyond. During the research that eventually became my book To Rule the Skies, I spent years searching Air Force archives for the forgotten origins of American military space power. I was fortunate to help get a large number of obscure Cold War records declassified. But one of the most fascinating was this July 1959 report, Military Implications of the Orion Vehicle. Some portions remain removed or obscured, but most of Mixson's argument is now available to the public. And what makes it so interesting is that it was not really a report about rocket technology at all. It was an early attempt to develop a doctrine for military power in space. Project Orion began with an almost absurdly powerful idea. Instead of burning chemical fuel inside a rocket engine, an Orion spacecraft would eject a small nuclear explosive behind itself. The device would detonate. The blast would strike a massive pusher plate protected by shock absorbers. Then another device would be released. Then another. Then another. Dozens or hundreds of carefully controlled nuclear explosions could accelerate a spacecraft weighing thousands and potentially tens of thousands of tons into orbit and beyond. Chemical rockets force spacecraft designers to struggle over every pound. Orion promised the exact opposite. Mixson considered representative spacecraft with masses ranging from 4,000 to 40,000 tons. Their payloads could range from roughly 1,000 tons for smaller vehicles to 16,000 tons for larger deep space versions. He even noted that preliminary calculations placed the theoretical upper payload limits for a deep space Orion at more than 1 million tons, roughly the mass of a dozen aircraft carriers. Mixson therefore concluded that Orion would not produce a huge number of small spacecraft. Rather, it would produce a relatively small fleet of extraordinarily large ships. Donald McRae Mixson was not one of the celebrity scientists associated with Orion. He was not Freeman Dyson, a famous physicist, or Theodore Taylor, one of the greatest bomb makers in the Cold War. He was a professional Air Force officer. After serving as an enlisted Marine in World War II, Mixson entered the Air Force as an officer in 1950. His early career included technical and atomic weapons assignments, followed by work at the Air Force Special Weapons Center at Kirtland Air Force Base, New Mexico. After that service, he later served in planning positions connected to the Strategic Air Command and eventually retired in 1969 as a lieutenant colonel. In 1959, however, he was still a captain. The scientists at General Atomics were investigating whether Orion could be built. But at Kirtland, Mixson's job was to ask what the Air Force might be able to do with it. He worked with the Orion team and thanked Dr. Taylor, Dr. Dyson, and several Air Force officers for reviewing and assisting with his report. But Mixson alone accepted responsibility for its military judgment. And his judgment was that Orion could support not merely one weapon system, but an entire strategic space force. Mixson divided his proposed force into 3 major elements: a low-altitude force in roughly 2-hour orbits around the Earth, a moderate-altitude force in 24-hour orbits, and a deep space force operating far beyond Earth to the Moon and potentially even neighboring planets. These were not independent fleets. Each layer had a different purpose, and together they formed a defensive screen, command network, and strategic striking force dedicated to the defense of the United States in a nuclear war. Closest to Earth would be at least 6 major manned Orion vehicles, supported by a dozen or more smaller, potentially unmanned spacecraft. These would be the low-altitude force. Mixson proposed spacing these 6 major ships along a polar orbit, only a few hundred miles above the Earth's surface. That arrangement would place at least one spacecraft within about 10 minutes of either pole and provide nearly continuous observation of the polar regions, the most likely approach routes for Soviet missiles. 12 smaller vehicles distributed through multiple orbital planes could provide broader coverage of the entire planet. These orbits are almost exactly like the orbits that our current surveillance satellites operate in today. But these were not surveillance satellites. Mixson wanted the low-altitude force to operate as a line of pickets. Its mission was to detect an attack, engage incoming weapons, and, most importantly, force an enemy to attack the orbital fleet during the first moments of a first strike or general nuclear war. Each major ship might carry a limited number of extremely large nuclear weapons, along with defensive missiles and decoys. But Mixson did not claim this force could stop everything. Instead, he wanted to complicate an enemy's first strike to the point of impossibility. The attacker would have to divide weapons between American targets on the ground, including American cities, and the Orion ships overhead. The low-altitude force could then attack missile launch sites before the enemy completed its salvos. Mixson also proposed a remarkable defensive role, global interception of extremely long-range missiles, including weapons approaching over even the southern polar regions. Decades later, this defense from space of Soviet ballistic missiles would be called Star Wars, or the Strategic Defense Initiative. Beyond combat, these ships could provide reconnaissance, damage assessment, global communications, television coverage, and line-of-sight communication that would be difficult to jam even in the event of nuclear war. This force was not perfect. Mixson acknowledged the weakness of this force. Low Earth orbit was accessible. The ships could be attacked by conventional missiles from the ground or even enemy Orion fleets in orbit. But they were the screen, not the ultimate source of survival for the Orion fleet. The next layer consisted of 3 large Orion vehicles in 24-hour orbits. Mixson placed them near the equatorial plane, separated so that the 3 would provide constant communication coverage of the globe, just like today's geosynchronous communication satellites. But these ships would perform far more missions than communications. They could intercept enemy spacecraft that penetrated or bypassed the low-altitude screen force. They could also maintain almost continuous surveillance of the Soviet Union, or indeed the world, with enormous optical systems. Mixson imagined telescopes hundreds of feet across. From 24-hour orbits, he believed these systems might resolve ground objects only a few hundred feet wide, and perhaps much smaller from low Earth orbit. The spacecraft positioned near 90 degrees east would also serve as the combat operations center and communications hub for the entire spaceborne fleet. This is one of the most interesting parts of the document. Mixson was not simply scattering armed satellites throughout orbit. He was describing an integrated military organization. Sensors, communications, command and control, defensive forces, striking forces. This fleet was an entire orbital architecture, not merely a collection of machines. He also imagined each of these 3 ships carrying 8 to 10 extremely powerful nuclear warheads. The details become grim very quickly, but the larger point is clear. The moderate altitude force would combine warning, surveillance, command, defense, and strategic retaliation in a small number of enormous operational platforms. The final layer was the deep space force. Mixson defined deep space very broadly, from roughly 50 to 250 Earth radii, and ultimately as far away as Mars or Venus. These ships would possess enormous reserves of velocity and could maneuver into many different Earth orbits or even escape trajectories to other planets. The importance was their distance away from Earth, which could extend the warning time for attacks launched from Earth to between 1 and 4 days and perhaps far more. The reason this is important is because an enemy could not easily attack the entire force at once, leaving at least some of America's retaliatory capability still in existence in the event of a first strike, meaning the assured destruction of the Soviet Union. Mixson's proposed deep space force consisted of 3 retaliatory vehicles and 6 combat vehicles. The retaliatory ships could remain far from Earth, where they would be extraordinarily difficult to locate and destroy. Mixson believed that the first Deep Space Force ships would actually be relatively small, especially compared to the command and control ships in geosynchronous orbit. But over time, as technology improved and military requirements increased, the Deep Space Force ships could become very large queens of the solar system. In many ways, like the ICBM carrying ballistic missile submarines of the United States Navy. The combat ships would possess greater cruise and maneuvering capability, allowing them to fight enemy spacecraft that survived the low and medium altitude forces. Because Orion essentially removed conventional payload restrictions, Mixson imagined these ships carrying an extraordinary range of sensors and weapons, including technologies that in 1959, and perhaps even today, still sound like science fiction. Yet the central idea was not fantasy. It was survivability through distance, mobility, and dispersal. A strategic force based on Earth could be destroyed along with the society it was supposed to defend. A force stationed deep in space, however, could survive and retaliate even after a catastrophe. This was the heart of Mixson's argument. Mixson's initial force estimate included 6 major and 12 smaller 2-hour orbit vehicles, 3 24-hour orbit vehicles, 3 deep space retaliatory ships, and 6 deep space combat ships. That meant 18 major manned spacecraft, plus the smaller vehicles. The total payload placed in space would have been somewhere between 58,000 and 100,000 tons. Mixson tentatively estimated approximately 1,650 personnel in space. Including the enormous support organization on Earth, the total force might require around 50,000 people. He observed that this was perhaps 1/10 the personnel then tied up in the strategic offensive and defensive forces of all 3 military services. In his view, strategic space operations could actually be economical in manpower. But the most important part of this document is not any particular orbit or weapon. It is the strategic problem Mixson was trying to solve. In 1959, America's nuclear forces were based among the American people. Bombers, missiles, airfields, command centers, and industrial facilities made the United States itself the central target in any nuclear war. Mixson proposed removing the base of strategic operations from the physical proximity of American cities and civilian society. With Orion, space itself would become the strategic nuclear base of operations. The enemy would be compelled to attack military forces away from Earth, rather than immediately targeting and destroying American cities. A dispersed Orion fleet could survive a first strike, preserve America's retaliatory capabilities, and potentially defend the continent against a nuclear attack. Mixson wrote that, for the first time in a decade, it was at least conceivable that most Americans might survive a nuclear war, even if deterrence failed. Whether his solution was practical is debatable, but the problem he identified was real and profound. Mixson did not simply file his report and forget it. On September 17, 1959, he traveled from Kirtland Air Force Base to Strategic Air Command headquarters at Offutt Air Force Base to brief Orion to SAC leaders, including General Thomas Power. No transcript of that meeting has been found, but in January 1961, Power personally issued a requirement for a strategic Earth orbital base capable of carrying extremely heavy payloads from low Earth orbit to lunar distances and beyond. Its force structure and missions strongly resembled the strategic space concept Mixson had proposed. My research concluded that Mixson's influence on the requirement was unmistakable, mostly because Power had him personally removed from Kirtland Air Force Base and placed on SAC headquarters staff shortly after the 1961 meeting. Mixson was not the only Air Force officer developing ideas for Orion warfare. Fred Gorshboth and others would take this concept much farther into the organization, tactics, and strategy of an actual deep space military force. That larger collection of documents deserves an episode of its own, and it will be coming. Donald Mixson never became a famous general. He retired as a lieutenant colonel, and his role in the history of military space power was largely forgotten. But in 1959, before any human being had even orbited Earth, this young Air Force captain outlined a layered military space force extending from low Earth orbit to deep into the solar system. He considered its ships, its crews, its patrol zones, its communications, its command structure, its costs, and its place in American nuclear strategy. Mixson did not simply imagine an armed spacecraft. He imagined what may have been the first integrated American military space force. And for a brief moment, the United States Air Force took that idea seriously. Frontiers of Power Declassified is a new segment dedicated to bringing history's forgotten classified documents back into the light. Using modern AI tools, we restore damaged pages, reconstruct faded photographs and illustrations, and create historically grounded visualizations of the ideas these documents describe, making them easier to understand than ever before while remaining faithful to the historical record. Our goal isn't to rewrite history, it's to reveal it. Join us as we uncover the documents that were hidden from public view, restore them to life, and bring forgotten chapters of strategic history back into the conversation. I'm Brent Zarnick, and this is the Frontiers of Power.